Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at the Champions Chess Tour Aimchess Rapid event. Now Magnus Carlsen has been on an absolute rampage. He won the Grand Chess Tour event in Zagreb, Croatia. He of course has been beating everybody here in the Champions Chess Tour. On Wednesday he won a very big match against Nodirbek Abdusattorov by a score of 2.5, and he was waiting yesterday to see who he would face, who would emerge as the winner of the losers bracket. Now at the end of the day, Wesley won a very tightly contested matchup against Nodirbek Abdusattorov to make his way into the grand final, where he would play against Magnus Carlsen. Now obviously with Magnus being the winner of the winners bracket, this meant he had a massive edge over Wesley. For starters, they would play a 4-game match of rapid chess with 15 minutes plus 2-second increment, but Wesley would have to win that match, and then they would reset and play a second match if Wesley could even get that far. So obviously Wesley needing to win 2 matches against Magnus to win the whole event, a big task, but if anyone is up to it, it probably would be Wesley. All right, let's jump right into the action. So here we go. Game number 1 of the first match, 4 games of rapid chess, Magnus with the white pieces. We get d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, g3. Now all this very standard. Magnus has been playing a lot of Catalan system, the opening that he did play in the World Chess Championship match in 2021 against Jan Nepomniachtchi. So obviously there's a lot of preparation that Magnus did not use from that match, and he's been saving it for a while. So we get bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, d takes c4, and now queen a4 is played by Magnus. Now it's worth noting that in this position the main line is this move queen c2, but after queen c2 black has a lot of options. Black can play b5, a6, knight c6, etc. So with so many options here for black, Magnus decides to throw in a wrinkle by playing queen a4. Now one of the reasons that white normally plays queen c2 is that after a6 white can play a4 here, stopping this b5 line, but Magnus decides to change it up and play queen a4 here because after a6 he just wants to capture the pawn anyway, and after b5 he goes queen c2. We get bishop b7, bishop to d2, and this is one of the very old lines. In the old days, a lot of players here would play moves like knight bd7 or potentially bishop e4, bishop d6, etc. But in this new age, there's this line with bishop e4, queen c1, and c6. Now I might be wrong on this in terms of my knowledge, but I think the first player who actually played this line with bishop e4, c6 at the top level and had success was none other than the former world chess champion Vladimir Kramnik, when I believe he played it in the London Chess Classic against Anish Giri in like 2010 or 2011. Nonetheless, this line has become very common at the top level. One of the reasons it's become common is that normally here, if black were to play c6, you lock in the bishop on b7 behind this pawn, and after a move like knight e5, there always are issues opening up this long diagonal. So after bishop e4, queen c1, and c6, what black is doing here is black wants to play knight d7 and rook c8 with the standard development, but now the bishop is outside the chain. So if white ever goes knight e5, you simply trade the bishops off the board, and now you no longer have this weak bishop on the b7 square. So after c6 we get e3, knight d7, knight c3, bishop g6, knight h4, bishop h5. All this, by the way, is standard theory pretty much, and now Magnus plays this move queen to e1. Wesley uses a bit of time here, about a minute, to play rook c8, simply guarding the pawn on c6. Now it's worth noting, if white were to take the pawn on c6 with a bishop after rook c8, if you go bishop g2, black has b4, pinning the knight on c3 and winning material. And if you play bishop b7, simply rook c7, bishop has to go somewhere, and once again this b4 threat is fatal for white. So we get queen to e1, rook c8, and now Magnus plays knight e2. Now this is a spot where Wesley used a bit of time. He used about a minute 40 before playing c5. Now this is actually the critical point in the game, and one thing that you will not hear in any other YouTube video, and you will probably not even hear in general across the spectrum, is how important psychology and knowing your opponent's style is. Now this position is actually not all that special for white, and Magnus mentioned this in the post-game interview. He essentially said that this whole queen e1 knight e2 has been played by his second, Daniil Dubov, and it's nothing special. And then he stopped right there. He cut himself off, because what Magnus did not want to continue saying, because he would give some insight, is that this is a situation where black has to play some moves that perhaps don't look natural and perhaps are not in the style of certain players. And very specifically, the best move here is a move that Wesley would probably never even consider if he did not know that it was a top computer move, and that is the move g5. Now g5 is the best move here, but it's a very unnatural looking move here, and for a player who's very solid like Wesley tries to be very solid, doesn't try to make weaknesses, this move violates some of the basic principles, because when you play g5, what are you doing? You've castled your king and you're pushing the pawns in front of your king. Now, as I have said many times, there are two important points. First of all, computers are so good that they can basically show you that you can play anything and be fine, but then secondarily, you're violating the basic rules of chess. You learn from the beginning, you do not push pawns in front of your king. Now, of course, sometimes we do try, actually. There are situations where the computers have shown us that you can just start pushing the H pawn very specifically up the board. But in this situation, if you don't know that G5 is the move and you're a very rock solid player like Wesley, so you are never going to consider it. And it's worth noting, or worth pointing out, I should say, that G5 is the only move to keep some balance in the game. But Wesley, being a very practical player, very solid, trying to follow some of the basic themes and be very classical, decides to play the move C5. Now C5 is a big mistake here, and after bishop to A5 we get queen to E8. Magnus plays knight to F4, and already there are a lot of problems. This bishop on H5 is wayward here. Additionally, black is very, very passive. You have this one knight on F6, but otherwise, when you look at the queens, the rook, the knight, and the bishop, they're basically all on the first two rows of the board, so white has a massive space advantage. So here Wesley plays this move bishop to D8, trying to trade off one of his passive pieces, the dark square bishop. Magnus trades knight for the bishop on H5, and now he goes back to F3, because in this position you do not want to allow black to be able to take the knight on H4, because now you have these double pawns on H2 and H4, and they're not all that great. So knight F3, knight F6 back. Magnus plays rook C1, and now Wesley plays C4. Now, one thing you will have to pay attention to here is that when we go to this position after queen D8, Wesley uses a minute on this move, just like the previous two moves, and after knight F4, he uses 3.5 minutes to play this move, bishop D8. So once we get to this position after rook C1, when you look at the clocks, Magnus has 14 minutes and 6 seconds. He has used 54 seconds effectively, whereas Wesley has used nearly 9 minutes. So there is a massive time discrepancy. Wesley has 8 minutes less on the clock, and it's already a very tough position to play here because white is very active. There's pressure on the C file. White can bring the queen to A5 and take the pawn on A6, and white can even go E4 and build a big white center as well. So all the trumps in the position are for white. And then to make matters worse, you're also way down on time. So we get C4 from Wesley. Magnus goes B3. We get knight to D5 here. Takes, and now E4. An excellent move from Magnus, kicking the knight out of the center of the board. And now white has pawns on D4 and E4. You have a weak pawn on C4, and it's very, very difficult to play. So game continues with knight F6. We get bishop C3, knight to B6. Queen to E2 played by Magnus, connecting the rooks. Now you can play rook C2 and rook B1, maybe rook C2 and rook C1, some combination of putting the rooks on the open files. We get bishop E7, rook to C2 played here. Magnus wants to go rook B1, keep this rook on the C file to target the pawn on C4. Knight A4 is played. We get rook to B1, knight takes C3, rook takes C3, and now the dust to some degree has settled. We have a simplified position here. White has a big white center with the pawns in E4 and D4. Rooks on the C file and the B file, and it's very difficult to play. But more important than the actual position is that Magnus is up 6.5 minutes on the clock. Magnus is 8 minutes and 52 seconds. Wesley is 2 minutes and 24 seconds. Very, very difficult to play here with limited time. So Wesley goes queen D7. Magnus thinks for a bit before taking. We get trade. Knight takes E4. Knight to E5 is played here again with Magnus building up the big time advantage. He does have time to think, so he starts using it. We get knight E5, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop at the same time. Queen D5 guards the knight and offers a trade of the queens here. Magnus plays queen D3. We get F5. Queen takes A6, and now Wesley uses about 40 seconds, and in his haste he plays this move G6, simply trying to create an extra square for his king to run to. He doesn't go H6. After H6, the knight can jump to G6, forking the rook on F8 and the bishop on E7. So he plays G6, and here Magnus is up 4.5 minutes on the clock, and Magnus uses nearly 4 minutes to play this blundering move, rook to B5. Now, computer says here that rook to B7 is winning, and the actual reason rook B7 wins versus rook B5 is very straightforward. After black plays move queen takes D4, queen takes E6, and king H8, now white can trade the bishop for the knight and go knight to F7, checking the king on H8, and after king G7, the rook on B7 simply snaps the bishop on E7, or not, sorry, not rook takes E7. White goes queen E5 here, not rook takes E7, because after queen to D1 check, there's actually a draw with queen F3, queen H5, and the queen just yo-yos forever between these three squares. King can simply not dodge the checks. Now Magnus used a lot of time here calculating the line, and probably, I don't know if he didn't see this or what he missed exactly, but the reason that this is so cleanly winning here is that you can play queen to E5 check, queens come off the board, and now the bishop and the king are in trouble. If you go king F6, there's knight D7, forking the king and the rook, and after rook to E8, knight to C6, white will gladly trade off all the material here, and with the king coming to the center here and the A pawn able to distract the black king, eventually white will win the game simply because you run the king up the board, you capture all the pawns, and it's simply 3 pawns versus nil, and you will win very shortly. So in this position, Magnus should have played rook b7. Instead, he plays rook b5, and this is a big mistake because now after queen takes d4, queen e6, and king h8 here, if you play queen takes e7, there's queen takes f2 check, king h1, queen e1 check, bishop f1 and queen takes f1 checkmate. And when you take the knight on e4 after takes, when you go knight f7 king g7 here, you'll notice the rook is on b5 instead of b7, so you cannot capture the bishop. If you take with the queen, black takes the knight, and suddenly we're in an endgame where black is only down one pawn. So here Magnus goes queen e5, and Wesley uses quite a bit of time here. He's up 27 seconds. The tide is shifted completely. Wesley is actually ahead on the clock, but now he uses nearly 50 seconds to play this move queen takes queen, which is the final blunder. What Wesley needed to play here was this move bishop f6, and after takes knight g5. Probably Wesley thought he was losing, because if you go rook to e8, there's rook b7 winning the pawn on h7. If you go rook takes f2, there's knight e6 forking the king and the bishop, and you lose the game. And if you play bishop takes f2 king g2, for example, now you have to go king h6 knight takes e4, and you figure with the passive king on h6 here, white probably is winning with ideas like knight g5 and rook b7. Now, who knows what Wesley saw exactly or what he missed, but he needed to play this move. So after he trades the queens here and he plays rook 8, now Magnus can go knight to c6 here, attacking the bishop on e7. And Wesley uses all his time, 17 seconds, gets down to 0.9 before blundering the game away in 1 with king f7. Now black is only slightly worse after bishop f6, rook a5, and rook e8. Nonetheless, with white having an extra outside pass pawn here, it's very difficult to envision a world where Magnus would not win this position, being able to push the a pawn up the board. That being said, the computer thinks that black is actually okay and the game should be a draw, but Wesley uses 17 seconds. He panic moves with king f7 right before he loses on time, and after rook to b7 here, Wesley has to resign due to the pin. If you go rook e8, it's the same thing that I mentioned before. White will gladly trade everything off the board, and again, it's the same thing where eventually white will distract the king with his a pawn. You have to go to stop it from queening, and then white just infiltrates with his king and wins the game very soon. So game number 1, Magnus draws first blood with a huge win. Now this game could have gone either way, but at the end of the day, the preparation, the understanding of his opponent Wesley So led to this massive time advantage, and Magnus converts to win this game. Even if it wasn't perfect, it was still good enough. So Wesley loses in game 1, and now we go to game number 2. Wesley down 1-0. It's a best of 4. He only has 3 games left to try and equalize the match. So in the game 2, Wesley opens with c4 with the English opening. Now, one thing that I thought before game 2 started is that Wesley would definitely have to take big risks, and so he decides to play the English as opposed to e4 or d4. So we get c4, knight f6, knight to c3 being played here, and now we have e5, knight f3, knight c6, and g3 from Wesley. Now Magnus did play this d4 move in the Grand Chess Tour. Obviously, he would have been ready for it, so Wesley tries to be more traditional. We get d5, takes bishop g2, and now Magnus plays this move knight to f6. Now the funny thing is that knight f6 is considered to be relatively okay. It's maybe a touch dubious. The funny thing is that I myself actually played this in a Titled Tuesday maybe a couple months ago, I think against Daniil Dubov if I'm not mistaken. And so this is a move that I'm aware of. Now most of the time people play either knight to b6 or this move bishop to c5, which Fabiano has played against Magnus. He played it also in the World Championship, but either bishop c5 or knight b6 are considered the best moves. But when Magnus plays knight f6, what he's doing here is he's saying, look, I want to play something where there's not going to be a lot of preparation. We have to play the game, and on the spot you're going to have to use time and try to come up with the solution to why this isn't the best move, without knowing or being able to use a computer, or prepare it, I should say. So after knight f6 castles, Magnus plays h6 here. Now the reason that Magnus plays h6 is very simple. It's twofold. First of all, you want to stop a bishop g5 move down the road, as well as creating some lift for your king on h7. But then additionally, you want to put this bishop on d6 if possible, whereas if you go bishop d6 right away, white can now play d4 in one go, and now you're not really sure what you're doing. So after going h6, we get a3, bishop d6, and now if white plays d4 and you get e4, for example, knight g5 is one move that is no longer available because the square is covered. So we get bishop d6, Wesley plays b4 here, we get castles, d3, rook to e8, bishop to b2, a6 played here by Magnus, trying to stop Wesley from pushing the pawn. Worth noting again, Magnus is up 2.5 minutes on the clock because most of his moves have been very natural and easy to play. So after a6, we get rook c1. Magnus plays bishop e6, developing the bishop. I was a little bit surprised by this move. I thought maybe he would go bishop f5 instead, but bishop e6 also makes sense because now their idea is to move it on this diagonal, but the pawn on h6 stops knight g5 once again. So we get bishop e6, knight a4, and here Magnus uses a bit of time, but he finds the absolute best move in the position, which is this very important move, queen d7. Now when you look at this position, it's looking a little bit scary here for black for a couple of reasons. White has this open diagonal towards the pawn on e5 and knight on f6. There are ideas on the c file with knight c5 potentially. If you're not careful, you could end up in a lot of trouble very quickly. One example is rook b8, and let's say white goes knight c5. If you play bishop c8, white can gobble the pawn on a6, because after pawn takes knight, rook takes c6. White is up a pawn here, and if you take on c5 after rook takes c5, knight d7, let's just say rook c, actually you can't go to c2 because of bishop b3, but just to illustrate the point, say rook c2, f6, and queen a1 here. There's a lot of pressure here on the c file. You have the stacked rooks. You can play knight h4, knight d2, open the long diagonal. It feels very scary to play, but Magnus correctly understands the position. He uses the time advantage he's built up here to play queen d7, because after knight c5 takes bishop h3, black is completely fine. And the reason black is completely fine is that you're getting rid of one of the active bishops, and white cannot grab this pawn on e5, or if he does, there is going to be counterplay. So Magnus uses 4 minutes, but he accurately calculates this whole line with queen d7 and bishop h3. Wesley trades, and now he goes bishop takes e5. Now I think that much of what happens here in the next couple of moves is a byproduct of Wesley trailing in the match and needing to go for broke. So we get the trade, bishop takes e5 is played, and now Magnus plays knight d7, forking the rook on c5 and the bishop on e5. Now Wesley correctly understands that he can sack the rook with bishop takes c7 here, but now Magnus finds an all-star move, and probably one of the moves that I think is most difficult to find, which is this move, rook to c8. It'd be very easy here to just instantly capture the rook and then play something like rook c8, but after bishop d6 and let's say queen e6 and e3, white is suddenly going to get the connect 5 with the pawns from f2 to c5 here, and white has a lot of play. But Magnus correctly finds rook c8 after a bit of a think here, and now the main reason it's so much better is that white cannot go bishop to d6. If white plays bishop d6, you have queen to e6 attacking the bishop and attacking the rook as well, and now after bishop f4 you take, and then the pawn on e2 hangs. So what happens is Wesley has to go bishop f4, but now after the capture, you essentially have the same position as before here with takes rook c8, except white wants to go bishop d6, but in the game, because you've inverted the order, now you get the position with the bishop on f4 versus the bishop on d6, and that makes a world of difference. We get queen to e6, e3 played here by Wesley, knight to e7, and now knight d4 played here, queen d5, bishop to d6. Now knight b3 would have been the best move to hold the pawn, but I think at this point Wesley a little bit tilted, trying not to get too low on time. He plays bishop d6 with a very basic concept. He figures the bishop is held by the pawn. You've got a great bastion with the knight on d4, and long term if you get like queen g4, maybe knight f5, there are going to be a lot of chances. But Magnus, true to form, does not make any mistakes. He plays this move b6, undermining the bishop on d6. The pawn on c5 now is very weak. If you take the pawn, you lose the bishop, and after bishop takes knight, you do not take the bishop, because after rook takes bishop, c takes b6. White now has 3 pawns and a knight for the rook. Instead you go b takes c5, attacking the knight and the bishop at the same time. Knight can't go to either c6 or f5. Both squares are covered, so you will lose one of the 2 pieces. Now here Wesley plays bishop takes c5, which is simply a mistake, but at this point I think Wesley was a little bit tilted, and he misses maybe the last chance to where he could have potentially saved the game with this move queen g4. Now queen g4 would have been a very good move here, because after rook takes e7 you have knight f5, forking the rook and the pawn and winning the game, and after c takes d4 you have bishop f6, threatening the checkmate on g7, and after g6 bishop takes d4. Black is still maybe a little bit better after rook e6, but with queen f4 and all these threats on the dark squares and this great bishop on d4, white should have decent drawing chances. Instead we get bishop c5, rook c5, queen a4, rook c8, queen takes a6, rook to c1 played here, and now Wesley's in a lot of trouble because he has no light square bishop. The rooks are stacked on the c file, and it's all in all very, very difficult to play. Wesley goes h4, Magnus plays king h7, not the best move but good enough. We get queen a4, the swap, check, king e2, and now Magnus finds this very study-like move, queen to h1, threatening to checkmate the white king. Now there's no instant checkmate here because the d1 square is actually covered by the white queen, but the problem here is that if you play a move like queen to b4, for example, there is queen d1 checkmate. And if you say play a move like e4, which is another option, after queen to f1, king to e3, there's rook e1 check. If you go to d2, you lose the pawn at f2. If you go to f3, you lose d3 and then e4. And you simply don't have any moves here. You can't really push the g pawn or the h pawn, push the f pawn, it's mate in 1. So you can't push any of these pawns. You can't push e4, so you can't push a pawn. You move the king, you get mated on e1. So effectively it's like a weird zugzwang where you can't move the king or the pawns. Can't really move the knight either, because then again there's queen f1, king d2, and then a move like rook to maybe rook to I know it's rook to c7 or whatever, rook to c7, c8, doesn't matter, with ideas like queen to f2, simply winning the pawn. So you almost can't move the king, the pawns, or the knight. The only other piece you can move then is the queen. But after queen to b3, there's rook e1 check, king to d2, rook to b1. Very nasty move here. And Wesley decides to effectively end the game on the spot here with queen c2. He could sack the queen and keep the game going, but you would lose. And after queen c2, there's queen e1 mate. If you were to play queen a4, another example, there's queen e1, king c2, and queen c1 checkmate. And if you go queen c4, again, same thing. Queen e1, king c2, queen e1. No way to stop the mate. So Wesley plays queen c2, allowing queen e1 checkmate, and he loses the second game. And he is now down 2-0 going into game 3. So game 3, Magnus with the white pieces. And all Magnus needs here is a draw to clinch the title in the Aimchess Rapid. So Magnus plays the e4, Wesley plays the Sicilian, knight f3, d6, and now Magnus decides to play the open Sicilian. Now, I think that Magnus decided to play this for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think Magnus felt that he wanted to try to psychologically destroy Wesley by winning a third game in something that Wesley was trying to create a game in. I think he felt that he had a chance to destroy Wesley. If he could beat Wesley in the aggressive knight or if even, then what is Wesley going to be able to look back on very fondly from this match? And then secondly, I think he thought, well, if I win, it's 3-0. 3-0 would be much nicer than clean 2.5. So Magnus decides to be aggressive here and go right into the knight orb, and he plays this move a4, and now we get this move knight c6. Now, this move knight c6, as I mentioned during the game, after takes and a5, I feel like I've actually looked at this exact position. I think I looked at this maybe in like 2009 or 2010. There was an article, I think, by John Ems in one of the old Noon Chess yearbooks, if I'm not mistaken, on this line. And additionally, I also played a game in the US Championship in I believe it was 2012, when I beat Godikamsky in the a4 knight orb. So I have looked at certain positions like this with a5, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that this is known to be slightly better for white already. So Wesley goes to e6, bishop d3, d5, castles, bishop e7. We get rook e1, castles, and bishop f4. Now, one of the things going in Magnus's favor potentially in this game is that this is a structure that Wesley does not play very often. Black has a sort of pawn structure with the pawns on c6, d5, and e6, creating the classic triangle. Black would like to push them, but it's not so obvious how you push them. And in the knight orb, you very rarely get this structure. One of the ways that you reach a structure normally is out of the classic Taimanov and Paulson setups with knight c6, d4 takes, e6, knight c3, a6, takes, and something like this, for example, where it's quite similar to what you have in the game here with this position, except the white pawn is on a2 instead of on a5. Now, one of the players who's played these positions from both sides a lot is Fabiano Caruana, and as I mentioned during my live broadcast of this, I think that if Magnus were playing Fabiano, he would not go into the structure because of the experience Fabiano has, whereas Wesley is a lot less experienced in the structure. So back to the game. We get rook e1, bishop f4, bishop b7, e5 played here by Magnus. Played for a couple of reasons. First of all, trying to close the center, but secondly, opening up the long scope for the bishop on d3. Now, the drawback to this position after knight d7 here is that if black can get in moves like, let's say, c5 and d4, you can open up the long diagonal potentially, or c4 opening up this other diagonal. Black can potentially get some play here. So Magnus is definitely not playing for a draw. He's trying to go all in and win this game. So we get rook to e3. Magnus tries to lift the rook, and here Wesley finds g6, an excellent move to shut down the diagonal. Rook h3 played by Magnus, and now Wesley plays this move f5. Now, unfortunately for Magnus, rook h3 sort of forces f5 due to the match situation. I think if this were not a must-win situation for Wesley, there's a decent chance he might play a move like knight c5, and the game could end in a draw after the rook sack with the queen check, and then we get this very straightforward repetition here on the side of the board, and the game would end in a draw. But Wesley, being in a must-win situation, he plays f5, which is the only move to dodge his idea with rook h7 and queen h5. Get en passant, rook takes f6, queen g4, and now after e5, bishop h6, and bishop c8, the tables have turned. Wesley has been able to activate these central pawns here. He's got the big black center, and the rook on h3 and queen on g4 completely misplaced here. The bishop on c8 is going to spy the rook on h3, and now it's feeling really, really scary for Magnus. So he goes rook g3, we got knight to c5, queen to d1, and now rook to b8. Another good move by Wesley, trying to provoke a weakness of this pawn on b2. Magnus plays bishop g5, we get rook to d6 here. Now, computer wants rook f7 here, which is completely fine objectively, but Wesley plays rook d6, and there's a lot of merit to this move for two reasons. A, it prevents a sacrifice towards the pawn on g6, but additionally, black can now try to push the d and the e pawns with the rook and the queen marching up the board with the pawns in front of it, and the tanks just bulldoze white center. So we get queen c1, rook f6 played here by Wesley. Now I would have liked e4 and maybe even d4 here potentially. Again, just try to bulldoze and take all the space in the center with the tanks rolling behind the pawns, but Wesley goes for something else. Instead he plays rook f6. We get knight to a4, we have e4, bishop to f1, and now Wesley trades the knights and finds this very tricky move, queen to f8, which basically causes Magnus a huge headache here for the following reasons. You cannot guard both the pawns on b2 and f2. If you move the queen to guard the pawn on f2, then you hang the pawn on b2, and so Magnus plays f3. Wesley plays queen c5, king h1, and now queen f2, threatening the checkmate after f takes e4 and queen f1. This of course would be the classic ice skater checkmate. So here we got rook a1, and now Wesley takes the pawn, Magnus takes back. Now apparently queen g5 is the best move here, but very difficult move to play, and considering the time situation as well, Magnus being down on the clock for the first time in the match, not realistic. So we get g takes f3, we get rook takes f3, Magnus trades and goes bishop g2, queen to f6, targeting the pawn on b2, c3, and now bishop f5. Now here Wesley is up 50 seconds on the clock, effectively 1 minute and 2 versus 47. White's king is loose, you're up a pawn here, there should be no issues. But this is one of the difficulties of playing against Magnus, which is that when he plays queen e2, because it's so hard to get a winning position, generally you feel a lot of pressure, you feel like you have to make very precise moves to win the game, and Wesley starts to let his time dwindle. He plays bishop e4, we get rook to e1, and he spends 20 seconds before playing rook e8. Now this is a move that you should play in 2 seconds. You just play this move instantly as a top GM. It's not a move to think on. So we get king g1, and now Wesley plays rook f8, which is a massive blunder by Wesley. In this position, the screaming move that should be played is rook to e5, lifting the rook and intending to play rook g5 and checkmate the white king. Instead we get rook f8, and now Magnus with 12 seconds misses a drawing opportunity. He plays the move queen to e3, which is wrong. What he should have done is traded the bishops and played this move queen to g2. Black has no checks on the g file, there are no checks on the f file either. Everything is covered. White will capture the pawn on e4 next move, and white will draw this game. But Magnus with 12 seconds doesn't spot it. He goes queen e3, we get rook e8, queen g3, queen e7. Another weird move here. Wesley should have played rook e5 once again. He's up 15 seconds, but Wesley feeling the pressure, he plays this move queen e7, we get b4, king g7, bishop f1, rook f8, bishop g2, and now finally Wesley lifts the rook with rook to f5. Get h4 here, rook e5. Both players low on time, of course. I'm not giving too many explanations, and of course most importantly it's difficult to play perfect chess. Now here after c4 Magnus would have been fine, but he plays rook e3. We get rook h5, c4 played now, takes. We get rook to c3. Magnus tries to create the classic pin on the 7th, as well as the classic right triangle. Wesley plays queen f6, we get rook c7, king h6, and now we get this move queen e3, and here Wesley makes a huge blunder. He loses the game with g5 in one move. Now what Wesley should have played was this move rook to f4, and after queen h3, king g5, black is simply winning because of the activity. You have checks on d4 and a1, you have rook g4 or rook h4 as well, and white simply can't do anything. Wesley instead plays g5, and now Magnus with 12 seconds misses the move. He plays rook b7. If Magnus had found queen to b6, he would have been winning in this game due to a very weird puzzle-like study. Now what you would assume if you have 2 seconds to look at this is takes bishop g2, and after b7 rook takes b4, king takes g2, a5. Black is simply up 3 pawns here in a rook and pawn endgame. It's a very easy win. But the reason that this move is stunningly winning here is that after you play, well, let's say you go rook g4 just to illustrate as well. After b7 takes king f1, you can't stop white from getting a queen. And when you take, white can play this amazing move pawn to b5 here. And the reason this move is so deadly is that if you take after b7, the pawn shields the file. The rook can't go to b4 and capture the pawn because you have a pawn in the way. And if you play this move like d4, white simply gobbles the bishop and plays b7. And when you play the move rook to b4, which is the last try, white can now play the stunning move rook to c5 here, and it's GG, why not? Because the rook guards the pawn and you can't stop this pawn from getting through. If you play a move like d4, once again I just capture the bishop, and if you play a move like rook b5, we swap, I go b7, and it's game over as well. So the only way to try and stop the pawn is to play something like rook f4 here. But now after king takes g2, if you take the pawn, same thing, b7, rook f8, rook c8 wins the game. And if you play a move like rook f8, for example, after b takes a6, the 2 connected pass pawns end the game on the spot. So this is an incredible resource, and Wesley would have actually been losing in this game if this happened. I know my weak engine doesn't illustrate until you see the actual line on the board here with rook c5, but as I go back, you'll now see the bar will stay up here. Let me go back. And as you see, now the bar actually realizes that it is completely winning for white. So Magnus has this great opportunity to win the match, and this ended on the spot with this tremendous comeback. Alas, he doesn't see it. He plays rook b7, and after queen a1, king f2, Magnus resigns the game in view of queen to b2 here. Black will win at least the bishop, if not more, and there's no hope to survive. So Magnus resigns in game 3, loses his first game of the tournament, and now the match score is 2-1, but Wesley still must win the 4th game with the white pieces. So here we go. Game number 4, we get c4 again from Wesley, knight f6, knight f3, e6, knight c3, d5, and now Wesley plays this move e3, trying to create something a little bit more in balance and just keep the game going. Magnus goes c5, we get d4 here, a6 played by Magnus, takes, and now g3 played here. Now, one of the problems with the position after c4 is that this is now transposed into the semi-trash. But one of the things about the semi-trash is a normal position that you could see is something like this, but you'll notice the bishop is inside the pawn chain. So the bishop on c1 is very, very passive here. It does not have squares. Now, the normal way you would get in the semi-trash would be in a different move order. You get something like this, for example, d4, c5, takes, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castles, let's just say bishop g5, a6, and e3. And now black can play c4 here. White's a little bit better, but the show goes on. But you'll notice that the bishop is outside the pawn chain. The bishop is outside. It creates all kinds of threats on this diagonal. Whereas in this game, when we get back to the actual game here, you'll notice that after c4, bishop g2, bishop b4, castles, now the bishop is inside the pawn chain, which makes it a lot less playable and frankly already a little bit better for black. But in a must-win game, you don't care that much about whether it's better or worse as long as pieces stay on the board and the game can go on. So Wesley goes knight e5, we get rook e8, bishop d2, knight c6, and now he plays this move a3, bishop a5, and b4 here. Magnus decides to chop and trade off the pawns. Knights are swapped, queen takes b3, and now Magnus plays this great move h5, which is based on fundamentally excellent understanding of the semi-tirage from Magnus here. Now, the reason this move is so good is that black has two options. He wants to play h4 and potentially h3 or trade, but it depends on what white does here. Now, if white plays h4 to stop the pawn push after bishop f5, black has a great position here because down the road you can play something like queen to d7, ideas like bishop to h3 looming on the board. Additionally, there are ideas like knight g4 as well, just to put pressure on these pawns on f2 and e3. Now, I do think that in this game, Wesley probably should have played h4, but instead he goes queen c2. Magnus plays h4, and I think what Wesley misunderstood is that after rook f c1 was played, he forgot that Magnus does not have to trade the pawns. Now, the obvious thought is black trades, plays something like knight g4, and then goes something like queen f6 and queen h6 down the road, just to illustrate the point. But there really is no actual checkmate here with the king on f1 and the bishop on g2. But Magnus can play h3 here. Now, what this reminds me of is very much computer chess. Computers have shown that you can push pawns down the board, and one of the best examples of this is actually in the King's Indian defense. Now, you're probably wondering, King's Indian defense, what are you talking about? It's a completely different opening. But one of the best lines in the King's Indian that's played very frequently is you can get some position like not h5, sorry, bishop e2, c5, d5, a6, and white plays something like h5, knight d7. And you get a position like this, and you're like, okay, obviously white's going to trade the pawns on g6 and try to use the open h5. We've had this burn in our brains from a very young age that you try to use the open file. When you push a pawn with like a rook behind or even a pawn on the edge, you're always trying to open it up. But the computer actually thinks that h6 here is the best move with like bishop h8 and a4 because h6 really restricts the bishop in the long term. You're going to have troubles potentially on this g7 square, and even though it doesn't make a lot of sense to us as humans, we've learned from computers that moves like h6 are very playable. So what I think Wesley forgot here after rook fc1 is that Magnus can play h3, and what Magnus does by playing h3, bishop h1, and bishop g4 is Magnus tries to dominate on the light squares. Now, one of the moves the computer really likes here is takes, because after bishop takes c3, you can go bishop g4, let's just say rook a2, queen d7, and black is going to go knight e4 and queen f5, and there are all kinds of problems on these light squares around the king, very specifically because you have this pawn on h3. So we get bishop g4 instead, knight b1, Magnus goes bishop b6, Wesley plays bishop b4, and now knight e4 comes in, and Magnus is just going to go queen f6, and again, try to play on these light squares around the white king, and white doesn't really have anything good to do here. If you were to play a move like f3, you lose on the spot after queen g5, because when you go rook to e1, trying to guard the pawn on e3, black can sack the bishop, sack the knight, and now you're losing a bunch of material around your king, and with it, you're going to lose the game. So Wesley plays the committal bishop takes knight. We got rook takes, knight d2, rook to e6, and now queen d3. Now what Wesley is trying to do is A, keep the game going, but B, argue that the knight on d2 stops black from ever being able to infiltrate on these light squares around either f3 or e4, and the knight can hold the squares, and then maybe you can stack the rooks and play on the queen side. But unfortunately, it's just not enough. Magnus plays queen f6. We got queen f1 here. Rook e to e8 is played. We got rook a b1, rook to b8. Magnus decides to put the rooks on the queen side, and what Magnus also realizes about this position is that even though the c6 pawn looks weak, the queen always guards it. The bishop on g4 always creates threats towards the king side, and white can't really improve his position. So Wesley plays bishop c5. We got bishop a5, bishop b4, bishop c7 here. Now of course Wesley would love to go bishop c5 and offer the trade of all the rooks, but Magnus would go bishop a5 and simply offer a draw due to the match situation. So Wesley goes bishop c3. We got a5 here, preventing white from ever putting the bishop back on b4, and down the road you want to play bishop d6. We get f3 here. Now f3 is a very committal move, and it starts to essentially lose the game, but at this point you have to try to win. There's no difference. A draw or a loss are the exact same thing, and maybe if Magnus gets low on time, maybe you can create some complications, maybe a mouse slip, maybe a blunder, anything goes. So we get bishop f5, e4. Magnus goes bishop e6 here. Wesley plays e5, and now after queen to e7, it's really starting to look ugly because the bishop can always go back to f5 and target the rook. You can also play f6 or c5, and with all the pawn breaks, the bishop pair, the weak white king in particular with the pawn on h3, it's very hard to play and keep the game going. So Wesley plays rook a1. We get c5, queen to f2, threatening to capture the pawn. Magnus goes c4. We get g4, and now he plays this excellent move f6, trying to rip open this long diagonal towards the pawn on h2. And here the position is effectively lost for Wesley, but the time has evened out, so there's still a small glimmer of hope that maybe Wesley can do something. But here he effectively loses the game with king h1. Now queen h4 is the other move that he could play to keep the game going, but after a move like queen to d8, the big problem you have here is that if you take, you always end up in an end game here where the bishop is very active on f4. Pawns on h2 and h3, that also is a huge problem for white as well, and so there's not a whole lot you can do. So Wesley here instead plays king h1, but after takes, bishop b6, you have to block. If you move the queen, now the pawns start marching down the board in a flurry. And after bishop d4 trade, Magnus finds an excellent move which ends the game, queen to a7. Now material is still even here, so you're probably wondering why I say this ends the game. The reason it ends the game is the king is very bad on h1. The pawn on h3 always causes problems. Additionally, after the queens come up, even though material is even, black has two connected passed pawns, the weak white king, and the fact that black can easily start pushing p, there's just no hope. So Wesley plays rook c2. Magnus, true to form, being very accurate, plays d4. Wesley grabs. If you don't grab the pawn here, you play king g1 after c3, knight e4, and bishop b3, rook c1, even a4, for example. Sooner or later, black's going to be able to double or go after the pawns on the e file and f file. It's just nothing white. There's nothing white can do here. So we get knight takes c4, rook c8 played by Magnus. Now to add insult to injury, knight e3 does not work because after pawn takes knight, the bishop simply guards the rook on c8. So we get rook c1, d3, rook c3, and Magnus finishes it off in style by trading everything off on c4, going d2, rook to d4, and playing the move rook to c7. And now, of course, we understand that Magnus is a time traveler. He sees the future, and he knew that pushing the pawn on h3 would be the reason he would win the game, because now the king can't get out. If you're magically able to remove the pawn, I'm just going to set this up for a second. If you were able to get this position, how do I do it? Yeah, if you were able to get this position with white's move here, white could grab the pawn, and after rook c1, king g2, white is completely fine. But because there is this pawn on h3, it's simply GG, why not? Now Wesley could have played king g1, but after rook to c1, king f2, queen takes, black has an extra rook, and Magnus will mop up and win within 10 moves. So he decides to play rook takes d2 instead. Rook c1 check, rook d1, rook takes d1 checkmate, and that is all she wrote. The king cannot move. It's game over. So Magnus wins the fourth and final game. He wins the match by a very convincing score of 3-1 over Wesley. So he wins $30,000 as well as some kind of random NFT for his victory. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, Magnus shows why he is such a dangerous player, so dominant. He's riding this really hot wave right now of playing great chess no matter who he plays. Very, very difficult to compete against him. I mean, I give credit to Wesley for trying to put up a fight, winning a game, that third game specifically. But at the end of the day, Magnus was too strong. He wins yet another Chess Champions Tour event. He has now won, I believe, I think he's won all three of the events he's played in, if I'm not mistaken. or maybe he's only played, I think he's won 2 of the 3, sorry. So he's won 2 of the 3 events he's played. The only time that he's played the Chess Champions Tour and not won was when he played yours truly, and he did lose to me in the Chessable Masters. Not that that's saying much, but nonetheless, Magnus has been dominant. We'll see if he can continue his form in the Bullet Chess Championship, which will be starting very soon. But nonetheless, it's been a great run for Magnus. A huge performance by him. Props to him for playing great chess throughout. I mean, in his post-game interview, he tried to say that he wasn't playing great chess. I would say that really, other than his first match against Jordan Van Forst, his play was sublime. There's really nothing else that needs to be said, and he's proving why he is the best player in the world. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of the Aimchess Rapid event being held on chess.com. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I will be back soon with some more great YouTube-only content. See you guys soon. Bye.